All right, so there are a number of you who, because of illness or injury or what have you, have missed a couple days here to start chapter 27. And so what I'm going to do here in the next 15 minutes, which is not a lot of time for the amount of material that we're going to try to get through, I'm going to try to get you caught up on the first couple days of lecture here in chapter 27. So do your best to, I'm going to do my best to try to pack these 2 days into 15 minutes because that's all that I have. And likewise, if you could follow along, take down your own notes as if you were here, that way, so it's as if you were here for those first couple of days. I might have to split this up and do another video, and if I do, then I will obviously post that for you as well. But without further ado, we're talking about empire and expansion in chapter 27. So imperialism, the Spanish-American War, acquiring new lands, all that kind of stuff. Basically the early 1900s, leading up to Roosevelt and his big stick policy. We can kind of skip over that. We didn't really give a lot of credence to that because we wanted to jump right into imperialism. So, as a way of introduction to what imperialism is that policy in which stronger nations extend their influence, either or both or all. One is economic, two is political, and three is military. And the biggest thing is that there's a power imbalance. We're extending our control over weaker territories or weaker countries. The big thing with imperialism, as I said, is a power imbalance. If you have two powers who are of relatively the same size, or relatively the same economic strength or political strength or what have you, military strength, that there is conflict, that's not imperialism. That is what we think of as sort of traditional warfare. Imperialism is where you have a much stronger nation extending their influence and their control over a much weaker country or a weaker territory. And this is something that we as Americans, we start to begin developing our imperialistic fervor in the late 1800s. So we're talking the 1880s through the early 1900s. We take some steps to sort of set ourselves up for imperialism in the mid-1800s, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But we really start to begin becoming more and more imperialistic in the late 1800s. And that's going to be where most of our focus will be. I guess that deleted. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to point out here on this map is imperialism in the modern world. So bear in mind that the modern world that we're talking about during this time period is 1900. Now, if you look at this map, I'm going to draw your attention to the country of Africa right here in the middle. And what I want you to notice is that it looks like a brand new crayon box. All right. Because it's largely been carved up by mainly European powers. So we're talking the French in West Africa, called French West Africa, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Anglo meaning British, which you can see Britain is that greenish color. Belgium is that darker green. You have the darker sort of red of the Netherlands. Germany has some holdings down here in Africa. And what I want you to notice is that the United States doesn't really have any holdings here. The United States doesn't really have any holdings throughout the world. If you look at other parts of the map, the United States doesn't really have any countries that it exerts influence over. Maybe the Philippines, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. Maybe the Philippines looks like it is that color, and I would argue that it is, given that we're talking about 1900. But again, we're gonna talk about the Philippines here in just a second. Part of the reason for this is I'm gonna remind you of that Monroe Doctrine that we talked about. And this is way back James Monroe was our fourth president of the United States, and he put out this doctrine to European powers like Britain and France and Spain that basically stay out of the Western Hemisphere, okay? And you'll notice that we have the United States, Britain was already in Canada, but outside, they also were down here in South America as well, along with the Netherlands and the French. But basically, the Monroe Doctrine was stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You already have some of these holdings, and that's fine. But you are not going to extend your influence beyond those holdings, all right? The Western Hemisphere is our place. It's our zone of influence. So stay out. And that's why South America, that's why Central America is not colored at all, is because there's no territorial acquisitions made from the European countries. So what does that have to do with the United States and why we don't really have a whole lot, a whole bunch of colonies in other parts of the world? Is because if we were to go and colonize other parts of the world after we have had this long-standing policy of stay out, it would make us look very hypocritical, all right? If we decided to go over and take over Ethiopia, all right, and have colonies in Ethiopia, or somewhere in sort of the Mediterranean states, if we were to exert our influence there, Europe, Russia, who is gaining power at this point, they would look at us and they would say, well, this doesn't make any sense. And it would open the Western Hemisphere up to European colonization and imperialist aims. And that's something that we obviously do not want. So that explains a little bit as to why this map looks the way that it does, and why we are still at this point are still very much isolationist, which is something that we don't tend to think of the United States as of today. We don't think of us as being isolationist. And we're not, but we're not isolationist, in the sense of, exuding democracy and imploring democracy. That's how we're not isolationists. We've never been a country really to go out and take over territories. And you're going to find that our attempts to do that really don't go very well. So some of the reasons that we begin to extend ourselves in the realm of imperialism, and there's a couple of them. Actually, there's three of them, and you see them right there. Our reasons are, again, military, they are economic, and they are cultural. And I'm going to argue that the military and the economic are very much linked. And so we will talk about them kind of together. And I'm going to start actually with the economic. Production in the United States is much higher than what we need. Okay. So you have a surplus of manufactured goods here in the United States. And when you have that surplus of goods here in the United States, what that means is that we're producing more stuff than what our own citizens can purchase and use. And what happens when you have that is you have a favorable, you've got a favorable market for trade. What we need is we need new markets. Okay. We need new markets to, it says, help relieve depression. There had been a small mini depression. There's this thing called the natural business cycle that we'll talk about as we move into the Great Depression of the 1930s. There had been a small dip in the natural business cycle, and so sort of a mini depression, if you want to think about it that way. And we need those new markets to sort of boost our trade. That term safety valve, meaning we need a place to safely dump all of these excess goods. Now, the military reason then is to build a navy that's going to be competitive, okay, with the best in the world. Now, why do we need a navy to go along with that sort of economic rationale for expanding our influence? Well, because this is something that we tend not to think about a ton, because with the exception of the Somalian pirates, back around 2010, we don't really think of piracy on the high seas anymore. It's just not something that we have to contend with on a worldwide stage. But this is a time period where when you're trading, you have to trade via the ocean. And when you trade via the ocean, you open yourself up to piracy. You open yourself up to foreign militaries imposing their restrictions on the high seas. And so in order to have that favorable balance of trade, you don't just need that sort of overproduction, you also need the ability to protect your merchant ships as they travel. So we need a navy to protect those merchant shipping lines. And so that's why the military and the economic are very much linked. Now, there is a cultural reason. The cultural reason, and this is something that we see throughout European history as well, is that we start to believe that other cultures were inferior to America, that the American way of life is the best way of life, and that we need to spread that way of life. There is also this idea of Christendom, that we have to become missional to some degree. I would argue that the idea of spreading religion during this time period is, in comparison to what it was like for Britain during the Crusades or for Spain during their conquest of the New World, we do far less proselytizing or missionary work on the whole, or I should say state-sponsored missionary work. We do far less of that than what European countries did back in the 16 and 1700s. But there is still a big push to spread the Christian religion alongside of these imperialistic leaps that the United States takes. Again, it's not as state-sponsored as some of those European countries, but it is certainly supported during this time period. Whereas I would argue that during today's time period, you would not get sort of the state-sponsored spread of religion. So these are the reasons that we have for wanting to sort of jump into the imperialist game. So some early examples of imperialism, and I'm probably going to have to cut this off here and make a second video, which is not unsurprising. Some early examples of imperialism. The first one, and probably the one that we're going to end this video with, is the 1867 purchase of Alaska. Now, at the time, in 1867, you've got to keep a couple things in mind. One is we're just coming off of the Civil War. Okay, the Civil War is about 2-3 years old, and that's it. So we are still sort of rebuilding after that. And secondly, we're still sort of in that expansion, that manifest destiny mode. Except for the problem is that we've kind of run out of real estate, and that's something that we could also talk about in terms of imperialism, is that it's just an extension of manifest destiny. But in 1867, William Seward, who is the Secretary of State, he purchases Alaska from Russia, which is just right across the Bering Sea. And it's called Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly. And the reason is because a lot of people looked at this purchase and they said, well, this really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's literally just a tundra. You can't farm Alaska. You're not going to set up manufacturing in Alaska. What are you going to do with it? Well, as it turns out, it does become very beneficial for things like timber, for minerals, and then we're also going to discover much later that there is oil in Alaska. And so there are some pretty solid reasons for purchasing Alaska. But there's another very important reason that we'll start our second video to get you caught up on with as well. And it's kind of tied in with Hawaii, actually. So I'm going to cut it off there. Again, make sure that you're just kind of following along with these notes. I know there's a number of you that are going to be watching these, and so I'm trying to get you caught up the best that I can with everybody else. I hope that you can rejoin us soon, and we'll pick up here on the next video.